It's a nice little sexy intro versus I usually do crunk. We're recording. Just take it in. This is the internet. It's chill. It's lovely. I love some chill shit. I'm a chill person. I've stopped the music, so it's over. Anyway, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on another episode of Interviews That You Didn't Ask For, where everyone on the show is someone I know. Today, I have a catchphrase and everything. Today, I have a dear friend of mine, Omega, joining us from New York, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Joining us from New York. Very excited to have her on. I picked this background, by the way, because we met in college and we both went to student affairs. And I felt like I needed to put myself back in the spirit of higher education. And if you look at the children behind me, they
look miserable.
Yes. And I also felt that spirit as well. So we're going to talk about higher ed because I cannot not talk about higher ed.
Okay.
But how about you give us an introduction? Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, my name is Omega. I am a Michigander transplant to Ithaca, New York. Everyone here, because my last job was in Ohio, everyone mistakes me for an Ohioan, and it really insults my soul. So I'm constantly telling people, yes, my last job was in Ohio, but I'm not an Ohioan. So yeah, that's a very important and salient identity to me, that I am a Michigander. I went to Grand Valley with Jazz. I'm a double alum from Grand Valley. And I stumbled into student affairs. I was not originally supposed to be in student affairs. I am a trained teacher, so I was planning on doing formalized teaching, and that just never worked out. So did a quick swerve into the other side of education.
So yeah, you said you were a trained teacher. What happened so you did some teaching?
Yeah, 2008 happened is what I like to tell people. So I graduated in 2008. Except that that was a terrible time to graduate. That was like the worst decision I think in my entire life. Was I originally was doing history as my minor, and after I finished that minor, that is when everyone let me know that I would be double testing in history for my teaching exams, because it's part of my major as well. And I was like, you stupid asses, why didn't you let me know about this before I finished a whole minor? But whatever. I won't call out my advisor on that one. And so Jen actually suggested I do sociology as a teachable minor, because I was like, wow, this is really unmarketable of me, right? To be out here with a double teaching in history sort of situation. And so I took an entire extra year to finish that minor, which at the time seemed excellent, seemed like a great idea to do. And then when I graduated, because I graduated technically a year late, right? It was 2008, and the economy crashed, and Michigan was already sort of in a recession.
Didn't Michigan always have issues with, what was it? We had too many teachers?
Yeah, so when I entered college in 2003, we didn't have enough teachers. By graduation, we had a saturation of teachers.
Because they were recruiting in Wisconsin and Indiana and stuff.
Yep.
In Michigan for teachers.
Yeah, they basically they pushed all of us to go and be teaching degrees. Everyone was like, yeah, we need teachers. There's a shortage of teachers. So all of us were like, bet, we're gonna be teachers. It's gonna be great. And then it was 200% saturation, because we don't plan our economy in Michigan. And so it was just poor planning and a series of unfortunate events. So I graduated in 2008 with a degree that was basically worthless in my state. And the way that teaching works is that it's not standardized in the way in which the profession is graded. So if I wanted to go to another state, either they have to have a reciprocity agreement so that they say they accept my license as is, or I have to do whatever it is that they need to get the ability to teach. And I just like
with law, right? Because law and banking with
yeah.
are the same way. Like you have to test in each state.
And
right?
apparently medical degrees, which I found out recently, I had no idea.
Really? Because there's traveling nurses, but I guess I don't know about traveling doctors.
Exactly. So I spent most of 2008 and half of 2009 looking for a teaching position. Also, I will say, look, I appreciate our alma mater. I think that I had a really good background in education. Like, I know my stuff. However, I don't think that they were very good at preparing us for the job market, or at least they weren't great for me. Maybe my white counterparts feel differently, but I don't feel like I got that, like, this is how you go and find a job sort of situation. And so I was sort of bumbling. I mean, I'm a first-gen student. Like, I ain't know. So I was like, when do I start interviewing? And how can I submit all my stuff when I don't have my degree yet? Like, they never explained that. So it was sort of a shit show. And by June, no, I would say probably by like February of 2009, because I was substitute teaching after I graduated, because what else was I supposed to do? And substitute teaching, I always tell people, like, it feels like your soul is being sucked out of your ear. It's the worst.
What do you mean?
It was the worst experience. Like, I originally wanted to teach in Black and brown, like, city schools. That was like my entire, like, that was what I wanted to do. And nobody stopped to tell me, like, literally nobody in the program stopped to be like, so the way in which you teach in city schools is not the same as suburban schools.
What's the difference?
So a lot of cities, like, I was teaching in like Pontiac. I wasn't like teaching in like, I don't know what, Grand Rapids. Like, I was teaching in Pontiac. It was like truly city schools. I don't really consider Grand Rapids schools to be the same city schools as like Detroit schools, Flint schools, Pontiac schools.
Okay, at first I was like, but then yeah.
Yeah. And like, nobody stopped to tell me that, like, the way that the students are used to interacting with authority is so combative in comparison to what I was trained to do, right? Like, I was trained to, like, give students hugs and to ask them how they're feeling and create community, like, all these things that are excellent in higher education, but excellent. But in a middle school in the city of Pontiac, that's not how children interact with adults. That's just not how they.
Do you think that the reason they didn't prepare you that way is because they see the issue to be with the students and not with the preparation of the teachers?
Yes.
So it's not like all students should like this, and if those over there don't, there's something wrong with them, not with our process.
Right. And we're talking about kids that are poor, kids that have parents who are immigrants, parents who don't really have the same education level as Holland, Michigan, right? Like Granville, Michigan, who are stressed in ways that we're not really like expecting or thinking about oftentimes in teaching school. And if we are, they're in special classes that we talk about it. It's sort of like over here. And they come at every situation as if it's a fight, right? And it's not like, I always thought, this is not a child's fault, okay? This is the environment that they are put into, right? When they go home, they're yelled at. When they go into school, they're yelled at. When they're on the street hanging out with their friends, they're yelled at. Like, they're yelled at all the time. And so when you're constantly being shouted at, it changes the way in which you think you're supposed to interact with people. Like, you're very bombastic, you're very aggressive. And I'm not that type of a person as an educator. And so it was kind of a rude awakening for me. Like, I was like, oh, this sucks, right? When I was in the high schools, it really wasn't so bad. Like, generally speaking, high school students regardless of their like where they're coming from, if you talk to them like they have worth and they have dignity, they're like, cool, like this is cool. Like, yes, I looked young and I was like light skinned or whatever, but like they still were like, I get it, like we can deal with this. But when you're talking about littler kids, I guess, they're at a stage in their development that it's not conducive to just let them be and do whatever they want. Like they will run wild.
So what do you do though? Or even if it's not what do you suggest? What do you suggest the field does? I'll say that. So that's everything from the education they give to future teachers to the actual teachers themselves.
Well, and I can only speak for Grand Valley and the way that they did it. We had a year of student teaching, and I specifically had requested Grand Rapids for my multicultural required teaching, and I got Holland, Michigan as my multicultural. Yo, exactly. I'm sorry.
How did they justify that?
Because it was 30% Hispanic students. That's what they said, right? It was 30%, and I was like, just because they're Latinx students, it's not this. Like when I asked for an inner city placement, like this is not it. Like this is true.
It ain't even really a city.
No,
I mean it's a city, but
yeah, but
it's not.
No. And then my long-term teaching, like my big one, was in Kent City, which is a rural setting, and like it didn't make any sense to me because I never ever planned to live or teach in rural settings. Do you know what I mean? Like even as an educator that lived in rural settings in student affairs, I never would teach in those spaces. It felt hostile in a lot of ways to be there. Right?
You wouldn't have taught well, I guess I'm thinking of Grand Valley, but like Allendale.
No, I tutored at Allendale. I already knew I would never apply, right? When I was applying for positions in Grand Rapids, I would do Kentwood. I would do Grand Rapids proper, of course. And like that was pretty much like that was it for me. Like,
and you said it felt hostile. So tell me more about what when you did do some student teaching in those areas, what was it
that was hostile?
Yeah.
I mean, it was an intensely white place. Like I had one student of color who was Black, and then like
Jeez. How many students did you have total?
So Kent High School is like 200 students, maybe 400 students at the most, right? Like, so, and I taught an array of grades, but like, so I was teaching 30 kids in a class, except for one of my senior classes, which was like 3 kids.
So out of 30 kids, you had one student of
one Black student,
one Black student,
one international Asian student, and one Latinx student. That was it. We got 3 kids. And like, and I'm not saying like, oh, that like he was one Black student in like many. He was like one Black student in the school,
which held like 1,000 students.
No, like 1,000 in the district maybe, but like there's like 400 in the school, right? And he was from Benton Harbor, like originally, right? And his parents moved up here, and the transition was rough, and he acted out in ways that were just so deeply inappropriate. But I didn't have anybody to like. There were no Black teachers there, right? I had nobody to and like you know, like,
and try to figure out what to do.
Yeah, like so like he would actively brazenly hit on me in front of like the whole school.
What? So how old were these students?
These were high school students.
Okay.
He would tell me, he's like, oh, what are you doing for your spring break? I'm gonna come by Grand Valley and find you. Like out of control, like to a level where like if a teacher had, like if I were a veteran teacher and I'd heard that, like immediately I would have written this kid up. Like it was so inappropriate. And there was nobody to like step in and be like, you can't talk to her that way, right? This is not acceptable. And I know a lot of people were like, well, like you could reach out for like other mentorship besides like black educators. But I had experiences where it was very clear that like nobody was really checking for me. Do you know what I mean? Like nobody was interested. I remember once it was like I was reading a newspaper article about an 18-year-old that got arrested, and they called him like an 18-year-old man, right? And I was like, you guys, like, that doesn't make you feel uncomfortable? Because I mean, like, we have 18-year-olds in the school, right? And he's like, well, he's an adult. What else would you call him? And I'm like, there are so many different ways in which you could mitigate man there. Do you know what I mean?
But you know, I think you were on like page 10, chapter 10, and they,
right.
You know, like that
they weren't there.
Response for them to think about, and the way you described the group, I wouldn't assume that they were ready for a conversation where you had to really look deeply into the language we use to talk about different identities.
Right.
We've all definitely seen where there was a young white kid.
Right.
And I done lost the thing out of my ear, who was like his 20s, you know.
Right. A young child.
25, but he's somehow a child.
Yes.
So, I mean, but if you can't even just openly admit that racism exists, I don't think you can say that through things as subtle as language. Right.
And so, yeah, it was just like, it was not my favorite. I mean, I appreciate my my home teacher, like that, like I worked with from a content perspective, right? Like, and I appreciate that he gave me so much control over my classroom to shape it as much as I possibly could. But if I had to do it all over again, like I'm not entirely sure that I would have gotten the training, because it wasn't what I needed. Do you know what I mean? And Grand Valley is, even though it is considered one of the best teaching colleges in the state, I still have a lot of critique on the whiteness of the program and the unpreparedness that it provides teachers to leave anything outside of what Grand Valley considers normal, right? So I'm a great teacher, and everyone knows that. Like, they're like, dang, you're a great educator. But it took me a while to figure out what kind of student I resonate with. And it's totally, I really want to stress to anybody who's thinking about being an educator, is that it's okay to not resonate with all students. You know, that's an okay thing. Like, we don't jive with everybody. I always say, regardless of where I am in my education, like, career, I will find a student that I love. I will find a group of students that I absolutely love. But I also have to recognize that as a whole, it might not be a place that works for me, right? So, so I did that. And so I was substitute teaching right after of college, and it was really hard because I just didn't have the support I needed, and I didn't have the preparation I needed. At one point, I was doing alternative school at Southfield. I'm from Southfield, so like I was hoping that like doing like subbing in the Southfield system was going to give me a shoe-in because I was an alum and whatever. And I remember like sitting in the room with other teachers for lunch, and they're like, "You're a great teacher." I'm like, "Thanks." And funny enough, I really work pretty well with alternative students, like the troubled kids, right? Like, that had been separated out. Like, I work fairly well with them. But they're like, "Yeah, you're a great teacher. However, it's unfortunate." I was like, "What?" I'm like, they're like, "Oh, well, no one's going to retire for another 10 years. So you have to wait." And I was just like, 10 years? 10 years, man. Like, get out, right? But like, also they were right. And so, yeah, I went to Korea to try and get some experience in teaching, even if it wasn't in my my subject area. And it was excellent. It was sucky, but like professionally it was excellent. And then I went to grad school to keep pushing it off, went back to Korea, searched for another year.
Yeah, I wanna talk to you about Korea, because one, I spent a lot of time thinking about traveling.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to travel to different parts of Asia. Oddly enough, what I really want to do is try McDonald's.
In every place?
Yeah.
Whew. Whew. McDonald's in Korea?
I specifically
Interesting.
have questions about that, but why don't you give us an introduction into like how you got to Korea, what you were
Oh, yeah. So you know Erica Buckley.
Mm-hmm.
So 2007, she went to Korea and taught. Like, that's what she, and so when I was like, I was like at my last, like my wit's end. Okay, so in the end of 2008, my mom told me that she had this friend in Kentucky who had a job, who could get me a job at a school in Kentucky. And like, it was at Moorhead, Kentucky. Again, a rural white school, right? But like, she was like, it's a job is a job. So I was like, cool. He's like, oh yeah, like he'll set up an interview for you. Like, we're gonna go down. I was like, okay, this is really like not the way that I was told I was supposed to get a job, like through a third party like sort of situation. And so we drove all the way all night down to Kentucky for this, what I thought was supposed to be a job interview. I get there. First of all, it had flurried. And because like they're in like the mountains, like they're in like, you know, the Appalachia, like people were like school had closed. They were like, no, we can't go. Like, and I was like, yo, it's like beautiful out. I was like outside in short sleeves. Like I didn't care, you know? So, but they were like, well, the admin are still there. So we went, and I remember my appointment was at 10 a.m. and they were like on Southern time or something. So like they were not ready until like at least 10:30. I assure you. And I get in there, sit down, I think I'm going to be here for an interview. I've got my portfolio, I've got my degree, I've got my transcripts. I'm ready for an interview. And it's not an interview. They give me an application. They're like, we're not hiring right now.
Oh no.
Yes. This man had told my mother a complete lie to get us to come down. And it was like, I got back into the car, I told my mom what happened, and I was just like, I'm gonna go to Korea.
Understandable.
Right?
So
like I was like,
how did you find out about the opportunity to go to Korea?
Erica basically was like, well, so when you're in teaching school, right, when you're in like the program, they have this whole like, they sat us down like one day and like to talk to us about what to do if you don't land a traditional teaching job, right? Like, what can you do with your degree outside of just public education? And like, you know, of course, like parochial school, like private schools, they're like, but like, there's all these other cool things you can do. You can teach at adventure school. I was like, what? There's like these like weird military schools where like, like the last leg of troubled kids go to, where they like take them in the middle of the night. They go out into the middle of nowhere. They got to build their own school. Like,
what?
Yes. Yeah, like they like make zip lines to get to class. It's all like non-traditional. I was like, well, that's probably a bit much for me. But they're like, you know, you can do international school. You can teach military kids. They're like, you can teach abroad. I was like, oh, okay. So a few of these things, international school, I was interested in. Teaching abroad, I was interested in. I originally wanted to teach in Costa Rica, but the way in which they talk about the package that you get, Korea had the best package. So when like Erica was like,
so but was it through, because I'm my question more is about like, I don't know why in my mind I imagine it's like a Craigslist ad, maybe because I used to be on Craigslist.
Yeah.
For people to come teach English. Where do you find it? Like, how do you find out about it? Where can you find something reputable?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really suggest the Craigslist. But there are these agencies that you go and you apply through. So my first agency, it was like Apple something or another. I didn't find it on Craigslist, I'm pretty sure. But I think I found it in like a teaching portal. Do you know what I mean? Like a search engine for teachers, sort of a situation. And you apply through them. So like they ask for a lot of stuff. It's like a fairly long process. So like you fill out your application, you have to give them your transcripts, you have to give them or like, you know, your degree. You have to give them a background check. You have to do a picture. There's like all of these different government things that you need to do for your visa. Like they have to all be notarized. It's like a big old packet of stuff. And like, if you have a teaching degree from an accredited US school, and remember, this is in 2008. So things have changed a little bit. But at the time, like if you had a teaching degree from an accredited US school in anything, a 4-year degree in anything, and you were a native speaker of English.
In anything? I thought
anything. Not in education, in anything.
It could be in sports medicine.
It could be in art. It could be liberal arts. It could be anything. As long as you had a degree, you were a US citizen and a native speaker, you could get a job. So the fact that I had a degree in teaching.
Wait, I have a question real quick though. Is this just for students, people who have just graduated, or can anybody at any point go do this?
Anybody at any point.
So like today, if I wanted to go move Korea and teach English.
Well, today it's a little different because.
Pretend there's no coronavirus.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so I would say in like 2012, the Korean government started getting a little more particular about who they wanted to come. But for a very long time, yeah, it did not matter. Like there were people that were teaching in Korea that like got their degrees in like 92. You know, like it didn't matter. Sort of, it was like the Wild West of teaching at this time. Like any old person could walk in and be a teacher. Okay. I had an actual teaching degree, right? I had an actual license. And so that meant that I could be paid more. I could get better placements. Like that's how they sort of tiered it.
Okay. But what would be the benefit if I wasn't a teacher? What would be the benefit of me going to teach in Korea?
So much. So much. So this is what I'm saying is like, it is a package deal. It's not like teaching in America where like you just get a salary and like, go ahead, right? Like figure out your own housing, figure out your own maybe like daycare or like whatever it is that you need to like be an adult. In Korea, like the package deal for going to teach in Korea is your school will pay for your flight there. They will pay for your flight back. They pay half of your national health care, which is cheap AF, right? And amazing. They pay for you pay into retirement and you get it back at the end. You don't pay for taxes. You get all your you don't pay any taxes for like 3 years. You get a severance at the end. They provide you housing. And at the time they also provided me a cell phone, and the housing is furnished. That's also really important. The housing is furnished. And you get a salary.
And it's nice housing?
I mean, depending on the school, right? So like as a system, unlike America where it's like you got public school, you got private school, but like they basically do the same thing, right? Like I guess like in a Catholic school you get like religion, but like everybody is doing math, science, you know, like whatever it is. In Korea, you have public school, which pretty much all kids go to, and that's during the day. And that is standardized. It's the same courses, whatever. Then you have Hagwon, which is private school or after school programs. And that is in the afternoon and evening. And that is specialized for like a particular subject. So there's Hagwons for English, there's math Hagwons, there's music Hagwons, there's like whatever it is. English ones are.
You know what? As you're saying this, I think I have seen this. I don't know if you know, I love Korean dramas, not TV shows, but the movies.
Yes.
And so I believe I've seen exactly what you're talking about in a movie I watched recently. I can't think of the name of it. It was about a guy in love with his teacher. But go ahead.
Yeah. So a Hagwon is like it's like a private school where the parents are paying a huge amount of money to send their kids to. And depending on how much money like your parents want to put out, they could send you to multiple Hagwons, right? You could go to an English one and a science one. You could go to a language arts one. You could, like, whatever it is. Like, whatever it is that they want you to get extra, like, intensive help in. And so usually you start doing this in elementary school and middle school to prepare you for your high school exams, right? To get into a good high school.
It's like tutoring, basically.
Yeah. But like, so my first year teaching in Korea, because I didn't really understand the differences between these two things. I taught in a hagwon, in a private school, and in a very affluent, nice place. Okay, like I lived in Bundang, which is a suburban area, like suburban Seoul. So, it's so hard to explain because I don't think Americans think about suburbs the same way that other places do. So we think of suburbs as cul-de-sacs and beautiful lawns, and this was not that. Right? Like this was a city, for all intents and purposes. People are still mostly living in apartments. In fact, I don't know anybody who didn't live in an apartment. Okay. But it wasn't Seoul proper. So it wasn't like the business section. It was like mostly residential. It was mostly families. I would say, like, I always said that, like, it smelled nicer. Not that, like, Seoul smells bad, but, like, it didn't have, like, that, like, sweaty city smell. You know, like, I would get off the bus and, like, I could smell the flowers.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
You know, like, because it wasn't as crowded. And by it wasn't as crowded, I mean, it was, like, 100,000 people. Okay, right? So, but like it was like an up and coming area. It's like where everybody who had like a business dad that worked in the city would stay. Like their dad would commute to the city, but like they wanted a nice, like cushy, like apartment that was like much bigger and better schools, right? Bundang has excellent schools. And like, not just that Bundang has excellent schools, it has an international school, that like is highly rated.
So is that, okay, an international school, is that different from the public schools and they're like the after school things?
Yeah. So international schools are definitely different. International schools are often taught by, like you teach your subject. Okay. So in an international school, I wouldn't have taught English. I would have taught social studies, right? They often require experience in the subject. So KISS was the one that was in the area, Korean International School. It was taught in English, but all of your subjects are taught in English, right? And they follow, usually it's like they follow either an American curriculum or a British curriculum or an Australian
curriculum. What is it for? Like what would be the reason I want my kid to go there?
Usually it's for students who either have parents who are foreigners or students whose parents want them to have a Western education to catapult them to Western universities. So if your parents, so like, for example, I have a few friends who they went to international school. They're Korean, like their parents are Korean, they are Korean, they speak Korean, but their parents wanted them to have native knowledge of English and make sure that they could go to elite schools in America. So they went to basically the best international school in Seoul International. And after that they went to places like Cornell, and they went to, do you know what I mean? Like they went to MIT, they went to like elite schools in America. Because their curriculum basically was an American curriculum. Like it wasn't
a degree from a really top school in America is seen as the same amount of value across the country. I mean, across the world. So other countries think a degree from Yale is a big deal.
Yes, a degree from Yale, Harvard, Cornell, Princeton. Those are like the Ivies are top notch. Right underneath that is, oh my God, what is that school that they do technology? Not MIT. MIT is also very, very high, obviously. They're really good for computer science. I think they're in Pennsylvania.
I cannot think of the name of
No,
it. No, not Stanford.
no. Stanford's in Cali. You know what? It's not important to me.
Can't remember either.
It's fine. But like, do you know what I mean? Like, if you think of any of the top tier state schools in America and above, right? Top, like those, and top tier privates, obviously, they have a lot of weight in international spaces to get the best jobs. So if you, let's say you graduate from Princeton and then you go back to Korea, like, it doesn't matter. What do you want to do? You can do it now. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter.
That's so interesting, because I just assumed that every country had their own top schools, and
They do.
Those schools is better than, because
No.
I would assume they were better than our schools here.
So they have top schools like Seoul. I almost said Seoul Day, like, you know what Seoul Day means. So Seoul University, right, is the top school in Korea. And there's like an entire system of like top schools. Like Ewha is like best for education. Like Dankook and like Hanyang, like these are like excellent universities. And going to a school in Korea, like these will get you excellent jobs, like no doubt about it. But there is a privilege to Western power that is given to institutions from America, right? And which is why it's really important. And this is why I am a little disillusioned with the way in which their English system works, why people are like, oh, it's so great to do this. Part of the reason why Americans and English and South African and Australian people are able to get jobs in Korea so easily in the education sphere is because there is a global hegemonic culture that skews towards Western English, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's seen at all levels in Korean society, like from my experience, that having English skills, specifically having Western English skills, opens doors for you that are otherwise closed. Okay, so that's why when people talk about whiteness in a global sense, for me, it's not just whiteness, it is whiteness coupled with English that really makes this like sort of double hitter for how we obfuscate like privilege, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know we like often think about this in America, white privilege, blah, 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 but we don't often think about how English is a privilege, like as a language across the world, as the lingua franca.
Native speaking with no accent.
Yes. Well, with an American accent.
Yes.
Right. And that's also really important to know, is that certain schools in Korea, they search for particular accents. So though I think of my accent is uniquely Michigander, right? Like I think I have a pretty thick Midwest accent, which you probably can't hear because you're also from the Midwest. But in Korea, my accent is like coveted. Right. So like, for example, in my second year, we were doing a lesson where they had to like write in certain words to like finish the sentence. Right. And one of the sentences, the word they had to write in was mirror, like holding a mirror to your face. Right. And I have a student, I would have multiple students in different grades that either their English level was so high that it was native level, they had lived abroad to a point where they were native level, or in some way they were native speakers, right? So one of these students, he had lived in New York. And so like when I was blogging about him, I would call him Second New York, because he was like in second grade and he was from New York. So he was Korean, but like he had lived in New York for most of his childhood and his parents had just moved him back. So he spoke Korean at home, but he was a native English speaker, right? And so putting him in an English class, like in a public school, didn't make a lot of sense. It was standardized to put him in any English class just like everyone else, but it wasn't benefiting him in the same way that it would help English as a foreign language student, because this was English as a foreign language, not English as a second language, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he oftentimes, now his English was exceptional, but he did pay attention in class. And I didn't care that he didn't pay attention in class because I knew I didn't have anything to offer him. And the things that I would need to get to offer him, I wasn't really, like, my hands were sort of tied.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I didn't care. But, like, there's certain times where I'm like, you have to do this to get out of the classroom, right? Like, whatever. And so that day he'd been messing around, not paying attention. And his friend was trying to help him get out of to leave the classroom. Because I was like, yo, until you finish this, it's a wrap. You got to sit here. And he's like, oh, fine. And he gets to this question about a mirror. And his friend goes, it's a mirror. And he's like, looking at him. He's like, what? He's like, it's a mirror. And he's like, I don't understand. What are you saying? And I was like, dude, he said mirror. He's like, oh, a mirror. Why didn't you just say mirror? And I was just like, dude, and it was the accent, right?
Yeah.
And so, everyone would always say, oh, and I'm going to call him Evan. That's not his name. But, I don't want to, put his name out there, right? He's like a college student. People, but they're like, oh, I really wish that I could speak like Evan. He's got perfect English, right? He doesn't have perfect English. He has New York English, right? Right? That's...
It's what you might hear on TV if you're watching TV shows.
Exactly.
You hear a New York accent.
Right. And so I had so many students that were like, oh, I hate the way I sound in English. I sound Korean. And so I would be doing all of this unpacking with students that are 14 years old about why there's nothing wrong with having a global English, with having a Korean English, with having a Korean accent, that there's a beauty in that, in fact. And that, no, I don't want you to erase your accent. I don't want you to mimic my accent. And so, and the thing is, I was installed in these schools, not just because of my knowledge of English, but because of my accent, because they want their students to sound like me. They want them to be exposed to what I sound like so that they can sound like it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm saying is I really have an uncomfortable relationship with that, because though I loved my students and I loved teaching there and I loved living there, I'm not comfortable with being basically a cultural imperialist, right? I am not comfortable with teaching people that there's something wrong with the way that their mouth forms words at all. I don't, that's not what I want to do with my life. So,
well, I have another question though, because we're
sure.
about global whiteness. There's also global anti-Blackness. And
Absolutely.
I've always been curious about when Black folk go to parts of Asia.
Yeah.
That there's not many Black people in Asia. What the response is. So talk about that. It's
also important to note that I do not read Black to most people, right? And I own that. It is what it is. I don't read Black to people. And the way in which Blackness is constructed in Korea, I don't read Black to Koreans. I read Indonesian, I read Hispanic or Latinx, I read, sometimes people ask if I'm half Korean. Calling me surprised at that one. I don't look Korean at all to me, but whatever. But I when they hear that I'm Black or that I'm mixed, right? It's sort of no, you're not. They're surprised and confused, right? So I always say my experience as a mixed Black person in Korea will not ever compare to what it feels like to be a person who reads Black in Korea. And I recognize that, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I will say that there are latent cultural biases about Blackness in Korea that by most of them I don't think are supposed to be harmful. that doesn't mean that they aren't harmful, right? So first of all, it's important to note, and I do recognize this, that for a lot of Koreans, their experience with Black Americans is primarily through the lens of the military, because Korea still has American military presence to this day, that lives, breathes in Korea for the reason of anti-communism, right? So and a fairly large presence of military experience with American military. And there are complex emotions about the American military in Korea that I think we should talk more often about. That on the one hand, we have some Koreans who are fully capitalists who believe in the, peddled American dream to be the Korean dream, believe in Korea as the rising star of Asia, right? And don't have any, I guess, like personal problem with the American presence. That is not all Koreans, though. There are a lot of Koreans who have a strong critique about American presence in Korea, about the way in which the military conducts itself in Korean spheres, the way the military demands space in Korea, and the way in which soldiers treat Koreans, right? That there's not the level of cultural competency that they expect out of the American soldiers when they're in Korean.
So I hate to say, but are American soldiers treating Koreans the way American soldiers treat Americans? Is that it?
American soldiers, they have a privileged space in Korea, right? They get a lot of money for being there. They get excellent housing. They get things that like other Americans don't have, like cars, right? And when they're off base, they're not off base to be part of Korean society. They're off base to party. They're off base to go to clubs, to generally be an American tourist, right? And so, like most Koreans, when they think about the American soldier, they're not thinking about them as protectors. And we should interrogate whether or not Americans are protectors, right? But they're thinking about them as disruptors in their Korean life, right? Oh, there's that soldier over there being too drunk and hitting on all these Korean girls, talking to Korean girls like they're sluts and prostitutes, using actual prostitution, being combative with, cab drivers, getting into fights, refusing to learn Korean, right? Like these are things that are like really offensive for a lot of people.
But they all sound pretty American.
They sure do, don't they?
Like
they sure do. And
sounds like a normal Thursday evening.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that like you have to be really hyper aware of when you're in Korea, is that there is an expectation or a stereotype of what America is. And like, yes, of course, there's the positive stuff about America, but like there's also this idea that we're arrogant, we're ignorant, we're loud, we're unapologetic, we constantly are in contradiction to Korean society, right?
And that sounds pretty true, yes.
Yeah, and there's truth in it. And I was constantly aware of it and constantly trying to interrogate the ways in which my American identity could be unpacked for Koreans. And like, again, especially when I worked in my public school, my second year, I was the only American. I was the only native English speaker in the school, and I served 1,000 students, right? I was the only one that did English tests. And English tests are, when I say like English speaking tests, they are where I sit with another teacher. We give them a topic, and they sit down and they have to speak in English. And you probably remember doing this in like a foreign language class for like an exam. Like you would talk for like a minute or something like that.
I don't know if I've ever done that before.
I did it in college. I remember doing it in college.
See, I avoided taking classes in college. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I did it in college, but like to do it as a 13-year-old is a whole different level of anxiety, I feel like. And so like you would sit down and like again, like Evan, this was not like he'd be worried for no reason. I'm like, you think in English, my dude. You literally think in English. There's nothing I can say to you that you're not going to be able to answer, right? But like for a kid who English is not their strong suit, this was make or break for them, right? So I would do all of that work for the entire school. Like nobody, because I was the English expert, I had to test all the students for that, even if I wasn't teaching their class. So, but I recognized that when I was in that school, part of the reason, besides just my accent, was that my Americanness was what they wanted me to peddle, right? They wanted students to learn how Americans put sentences together, how loud our voices are, like how we carry ourselves, all of this stuff that we don't think about as Americans. And my own agenda was a very different agenda. Right. And I would always tell it was hard for me because I recognized that my job was to speak English. That was what I was there for. So in school, I would speak English to my students, not because I wanted to, but because it was my job. And I was trying to give them as many opportunities to practice as possible. Right. But when I lived in my living situation in Korea, I tried to speak Korean as much as possible. My Korean is absolutely horrible, but part of that Americanness is that refusal, like not just, oh, I don't know. It's a refusal to learn, like at every juncture, to refuse to integrate. And not integrate as in like
that is American though,
right? Right. It's very
be as American as possible everywhere you go.
Right. To walk into a cafe in which the menu was completely in Korean, the speak like they greet you in Korean, and for you to speak back in English, that's American.
I think it's we're obsessed with someone taking our rights. I say we as Americans, not as black,
right.
But, and so we don't ever want to feel like someone has taken something from us.
Right, of course.
So we have to be uber American
all the time, right? All the time. And so like that experience, that is not just a white experience for Koreans. That is an American experience, regardless of what the American looks like. Right? So it started with those soldiers, but it intensified with English teachers because there was this influx of English teachers in the early 2000s. And yes, there is definitely racism in the hiring process. So there are definitely schools that will not hire Black teachers, or their parents will come in and refuse to let their child be taught by a Black teacher, right? Totally happens. But there are also schools where like, that was like, they didn't care. They cared about the English, right? And especially if they were a results-driven school, like a Hagwon, Hagwons especially, like, it's such a double-edged sword because they could choose whoever they wanted because they're private, there's no rules, but also they're trying to get paid as much as possible. So if you're a Black English professor with a high teaching degree from Stanford University, like they can't, what are they supposed to say? Like, no, like, like, you know what I mean? Like they're thinking about the money at because it's a business, every point. And if you're a black teacher that's got a typical American accent, right? Like there are certain ways in which they might overlook it.
And when you say typical American accent, because you're talking about the Midwest accent in particular, it's, to me, I always think of what does the operator sound like when you get, you dial the wrong number. Like the record.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the Midwest accent.
Midwest accent.
That is the American accent.
Yeah.
Let
The
me
California
say real
accent-
quick though, because I'm looking at the time and I've been trying to keep it an hour. And I want you to pick one of two questions I have for you. But we're gonna have to keep it short.
Sure.
One is your thoughts on I don't want to say Americans, but in particular, I'm thinking back to that one kid who crossed over to North Korea and got fucked up in the game.
Yep.
Or I was gonna
Stupid games win stupid prizes. Yeah.
The other question is, have you seen Parasite and what are your thoughts? Those are two very different. So you pick the one you would like to answer.
Okay, I want to talk about Parasite. Yo.
Okay, good. Because I just saw it and I'm. Go ahead. You talk.
Parasite is a cinematic perfection. I love that meme. Oh my god! And here's the thing: Parasite is a cinematic perfection from an American context for people who don't have the experience I do, and it becomes even more perfect when you have more Korean knowledge. Like that's the thing. Is like I remember we went to see it here in Ithaca, right? And Ithaca has a pretty large international like community because Cornell has a lot of international students, right? And so I kind of expected that there was going to be like Koreans everywhere when I went into the theater, but like Ithaca white people are a special brand of white people. They were out there, like they support it, and so it was like pretty packed theater. Mostly white people, I would say, but like definitely still some Koreans around. And there are definitely parts of that movie where Koreans and me, people who had a context of Korean like society, were definitely getting a different meaning from something. Like we were laughing at certain parts that other people weren't laughing at, or like we were cringing.
Tell me what I meant.
So again, love Korean dramas. I've been waiting for this to be somewhere I could see it because I didn't see it in theaters. And I did the other night, and it is literally in my top 10 best movies I've seen. Like, I feel traumatized still. And I read a review that was like, it sticks with you. It does. I keep thinking about it, and really, I think about I can't imagine being that rich, and I also can't imagine being that poor.
Right.
And
this is what I'm talking about.
I missed
the Korean context. When we think about rich, okay, to be rich enough in Korea to live in Seoul and own a house and have land behind that house, that is a level of rich that we like. It's so rich. It's so rich. Like when I was like, oh, right. To like, and like, okay, so remember when I was talking about them kids that I knew that went to international school? So one of those kids, I love her to death. Absolutely love her. She's amazing. She's a good comrade. But like, yeah, her dad is what we call chaebol. He's the elite of Korea. Okay. And so when I went to visit her house, and I met her dad, he's a lovely man. But like when I went to her house, she lives in the heart of Seoul. She lives in the same neighborhood that G-Dragon lives in. She has a house in a gated community in the middle of Seoul. And I was like, yo, like she has an exercise room. Like what? She was like, yeah, I'm kind of rich. Like, I'm like, yo, baby, you're not kind of rich. You're like a level of rich that I will never, ever be able to achieve. Right. And so like when they were like talking, like people were like, oh, that's a nice house. I'm like, no, like you don't understand. Like that's Elon Musk rich.
But the house, and just the house in the movie, I sat there and talked about, it was that window that faced the backyard. And I was like, how much money do I have to make just to have that?
Just to have, it's too much, right? To have enough money to have a secret hiding space in your house. Like, I mean, like what?
That you don't know about.
That you don't know about. That you have no idea about, right? Because you're so rich that you don't even care, like, to know your house. Like, you don't care, right? But then, yeah, like the poverty thing. So, like, yeah, we were talking about this, like the basement feel, or like my friends were talking about like this, the smell that happens in the packed like parts of Seoul that are poor, right? And this is what I was talking about, is like the smell of Seoul. Like there are certain parts of Seoul, like Gangnam, that it's rich, right? And like you, like there are parts of it where you're like, oh, like they're trying to make this smell better than it does, right? Like, but like there's always, it's a big city. You're gonna sometimes smell like, it sometimes smells like trash, it sometimes smells like the sea, it smells like all of these different things. But when you're in the poor sections of Seoul, it smells like poverty. Like it smells like sweat, it smells like garbage, it smells like smoke, right? Like
so people really do like the apartment they had that was like in a basement.
Yes, that's a real thing. That's a for real thing, right? Like, and like that's why I said, like, I was so privileged where I lived. I lived in a really, like, even in my Hagwon area, like, I mean, I lived in Pundong at both times. So and like saying you live in Pundong doesn't, like, it's so hard to explain, but like Korea, the way that you explain where you live, I lived in Pundong, which is a district. I lived in Songnam, which is a city. And then you talk about which subway station you lived near. So my first year I lived in Sune subway station. And my second year I lived at, oh my God, where did I live? Not Jongja. I lived at, oh, I can't even remember, but I lived down the street from Jongja. So like you live near like a specific subway area. Like that's how you like zero in where you live. And so, but I always lived, like my first year, I lived right in front of a mountain. I went hiking in a mountain anytime that I wanted. Yes. Right. I lived right across the street from the high school. So like, I tutored a kid in English that went to the high school, just because his dad randomly saw me on the bus one day. Like, and he was just like, and like, I was like, sir, I can't accept money. That's illegal. He's like, that's fine. And so he would send me like food. Like he would send me crates of persimmons. And
it was
like,
illegal for you to accept money?
Because it was outside of my contract. And
oh, interesting.
A lot of teachers don't care and they will accept money. I'm a rule follower, so I didn't do that, right? So he would take me out to dinner and like, and not like in a dirty way, like his family was there, like it wasn't weird. You know what I mean? Like,
you know.
Yeah. So like, or like, yeah, when he would send his kid, like who I would be teaching, he would send him with food or whatever. And yeah, like that's the sort of thing, like, but he was willing to pay me. Like, this is really important to know, is like, he was willing to pay me whatever it took to get his kid to be better at English. And one time we spent 45 minutes just on the word daughter because it was so hard for him. Right? Like, yeah, exactly.
So, but like even in Parasite, that he had like the little kid had like an art coach. I don't know what it's called.
Yes. Yes.
Thing too.
That's what I'm talking about. Is like tutors like this, right? So you could have your English tutor. Like I was an English tutor. I totally know what they're talking about. And they, as you could see, they accepted money, right? If you're Korean and you're doing English tutoring, you can, like, we're talking like $50 an hour at least. Okay, so and this is a rich family, so you can get a lot of money out of them, right? But not only is it like excellent in talking about the intersections of capitalism for Korean society, which is like for sure, but like the fact that it like plays across to an American audience, like that Americans got it, like. Bunjagon was so genius. He's such an.
Well, you know, he also did Snowpiercer.
Yes, he did, and it was also
an
excellent.
American movie. But I agree, because typically when I recommend movies that are not American movies, first you have to ask that question: are you willing to watch something where you have to read subtitles?
Oh yeah.
And
that was my favorite thing, is people were so mad that it was in Korean, and he was like, that was the point. Like, and I was like, yeah. I love this man so much, because not only is he an unabashed critique of capitalism, but he attacks the American hegemonic belief that they should always get whatever they want, and that a Korean film should be in English.
The thing that I really liked is that there's no villain. There's no for you to be angry at. There's
Right.
to be like, well, and that's the thing, and that was the second thing with when you're recommending a movie that's not an American film, is that it does not follow the same trajectory of an American film.
Yeah.
It's not predictable in that way. And so if this were if they took it and redid it and made it American.
Oh, please don't. Please don't.
I know, but you think about like they'd have to embed some sort of good and evil.
Of course.
It can't just be left that no one is to blame.
Yeah.
I mean, someone is to blame, but none of the characters.
Yeah, like this is, I mean, I think the point where it was like, oh my God, like that movie is just so good. So like really like the slow burn of that movie is
it was stressful to watch though.
The whole time. Because you're anxious about them being found out, of course. Right? But then you're like, wait a minute, like at the end you're like, that wasn't even like, why would you care if they found out? Like, first of all, you're happy that they're grifting. Like, do it. Like, get your money, right? But then what you're doing is like, you're incredibly sad because the other family that's grifting them, they fight against, right? And
they fight each other. You know what? I don't need to give any spoilers. That's the thing.
Yeah, I'm not trying to. Please watch the movie. If you watch this, please. Anything out of this interview, please watch this movie. And it's
available on Hulu. That's where I watched it for.
Yes,
it gave me subtitles in Spanish and English, but I don't even remember the damn subtitles. Like,
well, it is on top of the fact that it's like excellent. It's also funny, and here's the thing is. I don't accept
because
that people can't like
your sense of humor, like it says it's a comedy, and there were things I'm like, I guess, but I think as an American, I'll say I did not get the comedy. Like,
yes,
it was a tragedy to me.
Yeah, so like
tragic.
It's a tragic film, but like there are definitely portions where I'm like, that's hilarious, like that's like ridiculous and hilarious. But like, okay, so do you remember this like? The entire point of like how like the sense of smell as being part of the rejection of the working class, right?
Yes,
so, like,
it hurt my whole entire soul.
Yeah, but so like what this reminded me of is like, do you remember as a kid, like kids talking about the way that like Black people's houses smell?
Yes.
Okay, and like the Black answer to protect one's ego was to say that white people smell like wet dog, right? And that's the smell that they're talking about.
Oh.
The smell of dampness and of must. That's the smell. Right?
No, because now like this whole time I'm trying to imagine it, but once you said that, now I'm like, oh no.
Oh. And so we always talk about this. That's a smell that we associate with privilege and power. The smell of, I don't even have to worry about smelling good. I still do whatever I want, right? But in Korea, we have this flipped on its head. That's the smell of, I can't worry about what I smell like because I got better things to do in my life. Right?
It just seeps into everything.
And exactly.
Seeps it. Okay, look, I'm looking at the time, and I know we can talk.
Sorry.
Wrap this up. Parasite is available on Hulu. Please watch it. Let us know your thoughts. It's Korean, so it's longer than usual. I feel like all Korean movies are like
yes, it's longer than usual. It's in Korean. I will not apologize for that.
Yes. But I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for joining us today on another rousing episode of Ask For. Please join us again next time to post another video. Thank you and good evening.